Before the world was torn apart by machine guns, mustard gas, and miles of trenches, there was a delicate balance. A world ruled by emperors, kings, and alliances built on fear. In 1914, that balance shattered. But to understand how the First World War began, we must look at the fragile world that came before it. Europe in the early 20th century was dominated by powerful empires. Britain ruled the seas and held colonies across Asia and Africa. France, still reeling from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, was determined never to be humiliated again. Germany, newly unified under Prussian leadership, was rising fast, its industry, army, and ambitions growing each year. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of ethnicities held together by imperial will. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire sprawled across continents, a giant with feet of clay. And then there was the Ottoman Empire, once mighty, now labeled the sick man of Europe. In an effort to prevent war, ironically, Europe's leaders created a web of alliances. These pacts were meant to deter aggression, promising mutual defense. But instead, they guaranteed that if war began, it would not be small. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Opposing them, the Triple Entente united France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances were rigid, and they turned local conflicts into continental crises. Militarism swept across Europe. Nations glorified military power. Armies were idolized, generals were celebrities. Germany and Britain engaged in a naval arms race, each building massive battleships called dreadnoughts. From 1900 to 1914, Europe's major powers spent billions preparing for war, even as they claimed to want peace. The belief was simple. The stronger you appeared, the safer you were. But this race to arm would only make war more devastating when it came. Nationalism surged. People across Europe identified not with their emperors, but with their ethnic roots. In the Balkans, Slavic nationalism clashed with imperial control. Serbia saw itself as the protector of Slavs under Austrian rule. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, dozens of ethnic groups sought independence: Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, and Bosnians. The empire was like dry wood, one spark away from a fire. The Ottoman Empire was fading. Once stretching from the gates of Vienna to Mecca, it had become a fractured shell. The Balkan Wars had stripped it of nearly all its European lands. The Arabs were restless, the Armenians were oppressed, and the Young Turks were in power, desperate to reform the empire before it collapsed. To many Europeans, the Ottomans were irrelevant, but they were about to be dragged into a war that would hasten their fall. The years leading up to 1914 were filled with crises. Germany challenged France over Morocco. Austria annexed Bosnia and raging Serbia. Twice the Balkan Wars brought Europe to the edge. Each time war was avoided. Barely. But each crisis left behind bitterness, distrust, and wounded pride. Diplomats grew tired. Generals grew ready. The next crisis might not be solved with words. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a continent primed for war. Armies were mobilized on railway timetables. Plans like Germany's Schlieffen Plan and France's Plan 13th were ready. Everyone expected war, but no one expected what it would become. The empires of old, proud, powerful, and blind, were about to march into a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. A morning parade, a royal couple, a city on edge. Few could guess that a single gunshot in a small Balkan city would trigger a war that would kill millions. But that's exactly what happened on June 28, 1914. And it all began with one name: Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. A strict man with progressive ideas, he supported granting autonomy to ethnic groups within the empire, a stance that angered hardliners in Vienna and terrified nationalists in the Balkans. He wasn't popular among elites, but he was next in line. His presence in Bosnia was meant to show strength. Instead, it exposed fatal weakness. Bosnia was a recent addition to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, annexed in 1908. Its large Slavic population resented imperial rule and looked to neighboring Serbia for support. Out of this tension rose the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist group determined to free Slavic lands from Austrian control, by any means necessary. One of their members, a sickly 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, would become the trigger of a global war. On June 28th, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo for a military parade. It was an inflammatory visit, scheduled on the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a holy day in Serbian history. The Archduke's motorcade moved slowly through the city. Along the route, Black Hand assassins waited. One threw a bomb. It bounced off the car and exploded behind them, injuring others, but not the royal couple. They insisted on continuing. Hours later, their driver took a wrong turn, right in front of Gavrilo Princip. The reaction was immediate and yet eerily calm. Many in Vienna disliked Franz Ferdinand. Emperor Franz Joseph offered little emotion. But beneath the silence, the gears of war began to turn. Austria blamed Serbia, and behind Austria stood Germany, promising unconditional support. The world was about to descend into chaos, all sparked by a teenager with a pistol. What followed became known as the July Crisis, 30 days of tense diplomacy, threats, and ultimatums. Austria-Hungary waited for the right moment and then issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd, backed by German support. The terms were intentionally harsh. Serbia accepted most of them, but not all. Austria wanted war. Europe's leaders believed a quick local war would restore balance. Instead, they would destroy it. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilized against Austria. Germany declared war on Russia. France mobilized to support Russia. Then Germany enacted the Schlieffen Plan, invading Belgium to reach France. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In less than a week, 5 of the world's greatest powers were at war. The lights of Europe were going out. Across Europe, crowds celebrated. Most believed the war would be short. Home by Christmas, they said. They were wrong. They didn't realize the scale of destruction that modern weapons would bring. They didn't foresee the trenches, the poison gas, the deadlocked fronts. The war would last 4 years. It would kill over 20 million people. And it all began with a bullet in Sarajevo. In the summer of 1914, Europe exploded into war. Millions marched to the front, convinced it would be a quick, glorious campaign. But by the end of the year, the old world had crumbled, and a new age of horror had begun. Germany faced war on 2 fronts, Russia in the east and France in the west. Their plan, the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to solve that. It called for a rapid invasion of France through neutral Belgium, capturing Paris within weeks, and then turning to fight Russia. It was bold, precise, and reliant on speed. But it ignored one thing. Belgium wouldn't go quietly. On August 4th, 1914, German forces invaded Belgium, but the Belgians resisted fiercely. Fortified cities like Liège delayed the advance for days. Germany responded with brutality. Villages were burned, civilians executed, churches destroyed. Over 6,000 civilians were killed. The world was horrified, and Britain, who had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, declared war. The German invasion, meant to be swift, was already facing resistance and delay. For Britain, the violation of Belgium's neutrality was the breaking point. On August 4th, it declared war on Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, crossed the Channel to support France. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany that would strangle it over time. Now, the war was truly global, and it had only just begun. The first major clash between Germany and the British came at Mons, where the BEF fought bravely, inflicting heavy casualties but was forced to retreat. Germany pushed deeper into France. Paris braced for invasion. But in early September at the River Marne, the French struck back. Using taxis to move troops, French and British forces halted the German advance. It was a turning point. The German dream of a quick victory died at the Marne. With both sides unable to outmaneuver each other, a strange series of movements began. The race to the sea. German and Allied forces moved north, trying to flank one another all the way to the North Sea. When they failed, they began to dig. What began as shallow ditches became deep, fortified trenches. From the Swiss border to the English Channel, a wall of earth was built. A war of movement had become a war of mud, wire, and death. While the West bogged down, the East was on fire. Russia mobilized faster than expected and invaded East Prussia. But at the Battle of Tannenberg, Germany crushed the Russians, 90,000 taken prisoner. To the south, Austria-Hungary struggled. They were humiliated by Serbia and suffered major defeats in Galicia against Russia. Germany realized it would have to carry not only its own war, but its allies' failures as well. The war was no longer just European. Colonial troops from India, Africa, and the Pacific were sent to fight and die in a conflict far from home. Japan joined the Allies and attacked German holdings in China and the Pacific. In Africa, German colonies were invaded. The war had become global in blood and geography. By the end of 1914, both sides were exhausted. The trenches stretched over 400 miles. Millions were dead or wounded. And then, something incredible happened. On Christmas Eve, soldiers on the Western Front called an unofficial truce. They sang carols, exchanged gifts, even played football. For one brief moment, humanity returned to the most inhuman of places. 1914 had begun with dreams of glory and ended in blood and ruin. The war everyone thought would end in weeks had only just begun. Empires had marched forward. Now, they were trapped. And the price, in lives, in nations, in generations, would only grow. In Episode 4, we dive deeper into the horror. Chemical weapons, new battlefronts, and the war's expansion beyond Europe. The world would never be the same. 1915 was the year the war truly changed. The illusions of 1914 were dead. Now came poison gas, failed invasions, and the global escalation of what would become the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. By early 1915, the Western Front was frozen in place. Trench systems ran from the English Channel to Switzerland. Every inch gained cost thousands of lives. The war of movement had become a war of attrition, and there was no end in sight. On April 22, 1915, near the town of Ypres in Belgium, German troops unleashed a new horror: chlorine gas. A greenish cloud rolled across the battlefield, choking, blinding, and suffocating the Allied soldiers. It was the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in warfare, and it broke the rules. Literally, poison gas violated international agreements, but no one cared anymore. Soon, both sides began using gas: chlorine, phosgene, and eventually, mustard gas. Despite terrible conditions, the Allies launched several offensives. In Artois and Champagne, French troops stormed German lines. Thousands died for a minimal gain. The same story repeated across the front: massive bombardments, charges into machine gun fire, and endless mud. The generals still believed in breakthrough. The reality was slaughter. By the end of 1915, over 2 million men had died on the Western Front alone, and not a single decisive victory had been achieved. As the Western Front stagnated, the Allies tried a new strategy: strike the Ottoman Empire. The goal: capture the Dardanelles Strait, seize Constantinople, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. In April 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. But they met fierce resistance from the Ottoman army, led by a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. The terrain was brutal, supplies were limited, disease ran rampant. After months of fighting, over 250,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded, and the campaign failed. Gallipoli became a symbol of wasted lives and imperial arrogance. For Turkey, it was a moment of national pride. For the Allies, humiliation. On the Eastern Front, Russia suffered defeat after defeat. German forces pushed them back in Poland. Austria, after early setbacks, began to regain ground. But in the Caucasus, the Ottomans blamed their losses on the local Armenian population. What followed was genocide. Between 1915 and 1917, over 1 million Armenians were deported, starved, or massacred. Entire villages were erased. It was one of the 20th century's first genocides, and the world looked away. Italy had originally been allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but it stayed neutral in 1914, and in 1915 it switched sides. Promised land in the Alps and the Adriatic, Italy joined the Allies and declared war on Austria-Hungary. The result was the birth of a new front in the high mountains. Italian and Austro-Hungarian troops fought brutal battles in the Alps and along the Isonzo River. Avalanches, ice, and altitude claimed more lives than bullets. Germany began using submarines, U-boats, to blockade Britain. Unlike surface ships, submarines attacked without warning. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the British passenger liner Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 civilians died, including 128 Americans. The world was outraged. Germany claimed the ship carried weapons. Britain denied it. The truth was murky, but the damage was done. The sinking of the Lusitania didn't bring America into the war, yet, but it planted the seed. The war truly spanned the globe. British Indian forces fought in Mesopotamia against the Ottomans. French colonial troops fought in Europe and Africa. Japan seized German ports in China. African troops fought and died for empires they barely understood. In Egypt and Arabia, a storm was brewing. Rebellion against Ottoman rule would soon explode, reshaping the Middle East. By the end of 1915, the war had consumed nations, continents, and millions of lives. Old strategies had failed. New horrors had emerged. Poison gas, genocide, failed invasions. The war was no longer just a military struggle. It was a test of civilization itself. And the worst was yet to come. In Episode 5, we enter 1916, the year of carnage. Verdun, the Somme, and the war's most horrifying battles await. The old world was bleeding to death. 1916 was not just another year of war. It was the year death became mechanical. The year trenches became graves. The year Europe lost its soul. Two names would define it: Verdun and the Somme. Both would become symbols of destruction on a scale the world had never seen. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916. Germany's plan was simple: bleed France white. They would attack a symbolic fortress and force the French to defend it at all costs. Verdun was sacred ground to France, and the Germans knew it. Over the next 10 months, 40 million shells would fall on this stretch of earth. Forests were erased, villages disappeared, trenches became tombs. Both sides hurled men and metal into the fire. Verdun became a furnace that consumed everything. The French soldiers called themselves poilus, the hairy ones. At Verdun, they fought like shadows in a nightmare. General Pétain rotated troops constantly to keep morale up, but it barely helped. The air reeked of gas, rot, and cordite. There was no clean water, no escape, no silence. By December 1916, nearly 700,000 men had been killed, wounded, or lost at Verdun, for a battle that changed nothing. To relieve pressure on Verdun, the British and French planned a major offensive in the Somme Valley. Originally a French-led attack, it became primarily a British operation after Verdun dragged on. July 1st, 1916 was set as the launch date. It would become the bloodiest day in British military history. At 7:30 a.m., 120,000 British soldiers rose from their trenches and advanced across open ground. They had been told the German defenses were destroyed by artillery. They weren't. German machine guns cut them down like wheat. Entire battalions vanished in minutes. Communications broke down. Chaos reigned. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were casualties. 20,000 of them were dead, all for a few hundred yards of ground. The Somme would continue for another 5 months, becoming a grinding war of shells, mud, and slaughter. 1916 also saw the debut of a new weapon, the tank. On September 15th, the British used tanks for the first time at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. They were slow, unreliable, and often broke down, but they terrified the Germans and marked the beginning of mechanized warfare. Meanwhile, the skies became a battleground. Fighter aces like Germany's Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, and others turned war into theater. But for most pilots, death came quickly, often within weeks of their first mission. While the West bled in the trenches, Russia struck back in the East. In June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov launched a surprise assault on Austro-Hungarian lines. Using innovative tactics, like brief targeted bombardments and infiltration units, the Russians shattered Austrian defenses. It was Russia's most successful offensive of the war, but the cost was staggering. Over 1 million casualties on both sides, and Russia's ability to sustain such operations was collapsing. By late 1916, the war was grinding down the nations that waged it. Civilian morale was crumbling. Food shortages plagued Germany and Austria. In Russia, revolution loomed. Britain introduced conscription. France replaced its commander-in-chief. Germany replaced Falkenhayn after Verdun's failure. The old strategies were failing, but no one had new answers. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, colonial subjects continued to fight for empires that denied them freedom. In the U.S., the pressure was mounting. Unrestricted submarine warfare, British propaganda, and events like the Black Tom explosion stirred public anger. But still, America stayed out, for now. By the end of 1916, over 2.3 million soldiers had become casualties at the Somme and Verdun alone, and the war was nowhere near over. New weapons, new tactics, new leaders, and still no victory. Only more death. 1916 was not a turning point. It was a warning. The old world was breaking, and something darker was rising in its place. In Episode 6, we dive into 1917, a year of collapse. The Russian Empire will fall. The United States will enter, and the war will move closer to its end, but not yet to peace. By 1917, the Great War was no longer just a military struggle. It was a test of endurance for nations, empires, and ideologies. This was the year when everything cracked. The czars, the neutrality of the United States, the illusions of a quick victory. It was the year war became truly global, political, and irreversible. Starved by the Allied blockade, Germany made a fateful choice. On February 1st, 1917, it resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Every ship, enemy or neutral, was now a target. The goal was to starve Britain into surrender within 6 months. 600,000 tons of shipping sank in 1 month alone. But it would prove a strategic mistake. one that pulled the sleeping giant into the war. Germany's U-boat war and a secret message pushed America over the edge. The Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany promised Mexico the return of Texas and Arizona if it joined the war, was the final insult. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. But America wasn't ready. Its army was small and undertrained. It would take time, months, before U.S. troops would arrive in Europe. But when they did, they would tilt the scales. Meanwhile, in the East, an empire was dying. By March 1917, bread riots, military mutinies, and political chaos consumed Russia. The Tsar abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in a week. A provisional government took power, but it made one fatal mistake. It chose to keep Russia in the war. Soldiers deserted, peasants seized land, and the Bolsheviks waited, promising peace, land, and bread. In April 1917, Vladimir Lenin, with German help, returned to Russia in a sealed train. The Germans hoped he would sow chaos. They were right. Lenin's message was clear: end the war, seize power, ignite global revolution. And as the provisional government faltered, the Bolsheviks grew stronger. France, desperate for a breakthrough, launched the Nivelle Offensive in April. It was a disaster. Promised a quick victory, the French troops instead faced massacre. Over 180,000 casualties in just weeks. The army mutinied. Entire regiments refused orders. France was paralyzed. Only General Pétain's reforms, better food, leave, and no more suicidal assaults, restored order. But French morale never fully recovered. In July, the British tried again, this time in Flanders near the village of Passchendaele. The result was horror. Torrential rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Shell holes filled with water. Men drowned in mud. The British advanced only 5 miles, at a cost of over 250,000 casualties. By now, everyone knew this war would not be won by brilliant maneuvers, only by outlasting the enemy. On the Italian front, October brought catastrophe. At Caporetto, the Central Powers launched a surprise assault. Using gas and infiltration tactics, they broke through in days. 275,000 Italian troops were captured. The Italian army barely survived. The Allies rushed reinforcements to prevent collapse. Italy would recover, but the wound was deep. In the Middle East, the British advanced. Arab forces, aided by T.E. Lawrence, harassed the Ottomans. In December, General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem, entering on foot as a gesture of respect. The Ottoman Empire, already rotting from within, was beginning to crumble. In November 1917, Lenin struck. The Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government in a bloodless coup. Russia had changed overnight. A new radical power now ruled. Their first act? Sue for peace. Russia would soon leave the war, but it would pay a brutal price. 1917 shattered the world's old order. The Tsar was gone. America was rising. Germany was preparing for one last blow before the U.S. arrived. The war was entering its final desperate chapter, but for millions, the end was still far away. In Episode 7, we enter 1918, the final year, Germany's last offensive, America's arrival, and the moment the world finally broke free from the war that devoured it. The war was entering its 5th year. 4 empires were bleeding, nations were starving, armies were breaking. But no one knew this would be the final year, that 1918 would bring not only the bloodiest offensives, but also the end. With Russia out of the war, Germany transferred over 500,000 troops to the Western Front. General Ludendorff believed only a massive, decisive blow could win the war before the Americans fully arrived. On March 21, 1918, Operation Michael began, the first of 5 major German offensives known as the Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle. Using elite stormtroopers and innovative infiltration tactics, Germany broke through British lines, pushing them back over 60 kilometers. But there was no breakthrough, no knockout blow, just shattered ground and staggering casualties. Germany struck again in April, May, and June. Paris came within range of German guns. Panic spread. But the Germans were overstretched. Supplies couldn't keep up, and fresh American troops were arriving by the tens of thousands. Germany's last great offensive, but the Second Battle of the Marne, was repelled by Franco-American forces. The tide had turned. By summer 1918, over 1 million American troops were in Europe. Young, well-fed, and full of spirit, they injected new life into the exhausted Allies. At Belleau Wood, they fought fiercely, earning German respect and Allied gratitude. In later offensives, they helped capture Saint-Mihiel and break through the Meuse-Argonne. America had entered late, but its impact would be decisive. From August to November 1918, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of attacks that pushed the Germans back day by day. British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, now supported by tanks, air power, and artillery coordination, retook territory that had been held since 1914. German morale collapsed, mutinies broke out, desertions soared. Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria signed an armistice in late September. The Ottomans surrendered in October after British-led forces captured Damascus and Aleppo. Austria-Hungary was coming apart at the seams. Ethnic uprisings broke out. The Habsburg Empire crumbled into a patchwork of new republics. Germany now stood alone. In early November, German sailors mutinied. Workers and soldiers formed councils. A revolution swept across Germany. On November 9th, the Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A republic was declared. Germany had gone to war as an empire. It was ending it as a broken democracy. At 5 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, in a train car in Compiègne Forest, Germany signed the armistice agreement. The guns would fall silent at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. When the moment came, a strange, terrible quiet fell over the front. Men who had known nothing but noise for years finally heard silence. Over 9 million soldiers lay dead, 21 million wounded, tens of millions of civilians starved, displaced, or diseased. Empires had fallen, Russian, German, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, swept away by war and revolution. The old world was gone. What would rise in its place was uncertain. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war. It imposed harsh penalties on Germany, territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations. Many Germans felt humiliated, betrayed, and seeds of revenge were quietly sown. What was meant to be the war to end all wars had merely paused the storm. World War I began in glory, but ended in silence. It scarred a generation, redrew maps, and shattered illusions. It gave birth to the modern world and to the conflicts that would soon follow. The war is over, but its echoes still linger. In Episode 8, The World After War, Revolution, Resentment, and the Rise of New Ideologies. The road to World War II begins not in 1939, but in 1918. The war was over, but peace did not follow easily. The armistice ended the gunfire, not the suffering. For millions across Europe and beyond, 1918 marked not victory, but a haunting beginning. Over 70 million had served. 9 million soldiers were dead, 21 million wounded. Civilian death tolls from famine, disease, and genocide climbed even higher. And as if the war was not enough, a pandemic swept the world. The Spanish flu would kill more people in a year than the war had in 4. 4 empires collapsed in the wake of war. In Russia, revolution toppled the czars and birthed the first communist state. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into a patchwork of new nations: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary. The Ottoman Empire, once spanning 3 continents, was now partitioned by foreign powers. In 1917, Russia erupted in revolution. By 1918, it descended into civil war. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, fought royalists, liberals, and foreign interventionists. For the West, this was terrifying. Communism had declared war on capitalism. The Red Scare would haunt Europe and America for years to come. In June 1919, the victorious Allies met at Versailles. Their goal: peace. But the result was a treaty that many saw as a blueprint for future conflict. Germany was blamed for the entire war, forced to pay reparations, lose colonies and territories, and accept military limitations. Humiliation turned to anger. The war had ended, but resentment had just begun. The war redrew borders, but not always cleanly. Ethnic tensions exploded in Eastern Europe. Poles fought Ukrainians. Romanians battled Hungarians. Armenians clashed with Turks. Nationalism, once a spark for the war, now fueled civil unrest, border wars, and mass displacements. Italy, though on the winning side, felt betrayed. Promised lands had not been delivered. Inflation soared. Strikes paralyzed the nation. Into this chaos stepped Benito Mussolini, a war veteran with a simple message: order, strength, and revival. By 1922, fascism seized power. Italy became the first modern dictatorship born from the ruins of World War I. Germany, stripped of empire, grappled with democracy. The Weimar Republic was born weak, surrounded by enemies, within and without. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Veterans formed paramilitary groups. The far left sought revolution. The far right sought revenge. And in 1923, a failed uprising in Munich would introduce a name that would echo through history: Adolf Hitler. In the Middle East, Ottoman defeat did not bring freedom, but foreign control. The Sykes-Picot Agreement carved up Arab lands between Britain and France. In Turkey, nationalist resistance led by Mustafa Kemal rejected the Treaty of Sèvres. By 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born. From war, from revolution, from defiance. A League of Nations was formed to preserve peace, but lacked teeth, and the United States refused to join. The 1920s brought a brief illusion of recovery, but beneath the surface, scars festered. Economies were fragile. Politics polarized, empires staggered on. The storm had paused. It had not passed. World War I was called the war to end all wars, but it ended in vengeance, chaos, and deep division. New ideologies had risen. Democracies were fragile. Dictators waited in the wings. The next war was already growing, in broken promises, empty stomachs, and furious minds. In Episode 9, the world unravels, from economic collapse to totalitarian rise. The 1930s will show how the Great War never truly ended. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. After more than 4 years of carnage, World War I had ended. But the silence hid a far deeper turmoil. The war may have ended, but peace was not guaranteed. In Paris, the victors were preparing a treaty that would shape the fate of nations and sow the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. In January 1919, more than 24 nations gathered in Paris to decide the future of a shattered world. But behind the grand facades, the so-called peace conference was dominated by just 4 men, known as the Big Four. President Wilson came with his 14 points, a vision of peace, self-determination, and a new League of Nations. But Francis Clemenceau demanded revenge. He had seen his country invaded twice by Germany within 50 years. Britain's Lloyd George stood somewhere in between, seeking to punish Germany, but not destroy her entirely. Italy's Orlando, meanwhile, struggled to even stay at the table. Germany, the defeated empire, was not allowed to participate in the negotiations. They were summoned only to accept the terms, not debate them. The message was clear. This was not peace through dialogue. This was a dictated settlement. The Treaty of Versailles placed full blame for the war on Germany. Article 231, the infamous war guilt clause, was deeply humiliating. Germany was to pay crushing reparations. Her army was slashed, her navy dismantled, and her empire carved up. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Rhineland was demilitarized, and in the east, a new Poland was born, dividing German lands and separating East Prussia by the so-called Polish Corridor. Across Germany, the treaty was seen as a betrayal. Even those who hated the Kaiser felt humiliated. The new Weimar Republic, only weeks old, was forced to sign under threat of renewed war. Nationalists called it a diktat, a dictated peace. Seeds of resentment, ripe for exploitation, were planted in German soil. Germany wasn't the only one punished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled, giving rise to new states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and a larger Romania. The Ottoman Empire lost its Arab lands to French and British mandates. Bulgaria was shrunk. But these new borders, often drawn with little knowledge or care, created ethnic tensions that would later explode. Wilson had pushed hard for his League of Nations, a global council meant to prevent future wars. It was accepted in the treaty. But ironically, the U.S. Senate rejected it. The League was born without its most powerful member, and it would soon prove toothless. Italy, despite being on the winning side, received far less than expected. Its demands for Fiume and Dalmatian coastlines were denied. Nationalist anger surged. Out of this disillusionment rose Benito Mussolini, the first fascist leader in Europe. Italy, despite being on the winning side, received far less than expected. Its demands for Fiume and Dalmatian coastlines were denied. Nationalist anger surged. Out of this disillusionment rose Benito Mussolini, the first fascist leader in Europe. The Arab world, which had risen up against the Ottomans with promises of independence, found itself betrayed. Britain and France divided the region under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine became mandates, not nations. Japan had fought alongside the Allies and hoped to gain recognition as a great power. But when it proposed a racial equality clause in the League's charter, it was denied, mainly by the British and Americans. Japan left embittered, setting the stage for militarism and aggression in the Pacific. Though the Treaty of Versailles ended the First World War, it failed to secure a lasting peace. Many believed it was too harsh on Germany, but too lenient to prevent future conflict. It pleased no one, angered many, and ignored the warning signs of rising extremism. In the ashes of Versailles, a new storm began to form. The treaty meant to prevent war would help ignite the next one. Just 20 years later, the world would plunge once again into darkness.